My name is Oya Demirci. I'm head of library at the Goethe-Institut in Dublin. The Goethe-Institut hosts tonight's reading and discussion with journalist and author Khuê Phạm. Thank you, Khuê, for accepting our invitation. Our moderator will be freelance translator and editor Rachel McNicholl, and she will introduce Khuê Phạm and her background. Rachel did postgrad research in Switzerland and Germany after studying French, German, and Italian, and worked in journalism and publishing before returning to Ireland. She translated, amongst many other books, The Storyteller by Pierre Yaravan from Germany, or the book from German as well. She translated it together with her colleague Sinead Crowe, and this book was shortlisted for the 2020 Schlegel-Teague Translation Prize. Before handing over to Rachel, I'd like to remind you that this event will be recorded, as you might have heard, and you're welcome to leave the cameras on. Your image will not appear in the recording, but please make sure your microphones are muted during the reading, and for the discussion, you may put your questions into the chat, and we'll be happy to include them in the discussion. Rachel, it's your floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see such a turnout on Zoom, and especially a very big welcome virtually to Ireland for Khuê Phạm. Hopefully we'll have Khuê come to visit in person in 3 dimensions some other time. Now, I'll just let you know the format. What we're going to do is I'm going to introduce Khuê Phạm, and then she's going to do a short reading, a little bit in German so that you hear the original, and then in English, and then we're going to have a bit of chat, and then she's going to read from a different section of the novel in a different character, and then we'll have another little bit of chat, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. And the whole thing is to be wrapped up within the hour. So we'll try. Oya is going to, send off a fire alarm if I go over time. Okay. Khuê Phạm was born in Berlin, and she studied in London at Goldsmiths College and the London School of Economics. She worked, she did night shifts at The Guardian. I'd love to know more about that. And then she studied journalism in Hamburg at the Henry Nannen School of Journalism, which is a very famous school of journalism in Germany. And then in 2009, since 2009, she's been working as a journalist, reporter, and editor at seid, which I'm sure a lot of you know is a very prestigious weekly newspaper in Germany. She co-authored a sort of a non-fiction book, a book with 2 other writers called Wir Neuen Deutschen, We the New Germans, which is about sort of second generation immigrants in Germany. And her work, I think, explores a lot of, hard-hitting political issues, but also questions of race and identity. The book that we're going to be talking about this evening is her first novel, and the German title is Wo auch immer seid. Did I just say that right? Which loosely translates, or more literally translates, as wherever you may be. But the title that she is suggesting for English, the proposed title, and hopefully it will be available in English soon, is Brothers and Ghosts. And I think you'll see why when you hear Khuê talking about the novel. This novel is loosely based on her own family's story. Okay, so Khuê, would you like to read a little bit a little bit in German and then a bit in English. And
of course, yes. Thank you very much for the introduction, Rachel and Oya, and thank you all for showing up this evening. I was a bit afraid that people have gone tired of attending Zoom meetings, and I'm so happy to see so many people here, including some old friends. And do please feel free to put on the camera and put in your questions if you have any. I'm going to read a short section from the beginning of the book. And it's told from the perspective of the main character, who is 30 years old and she lives in Berlin. She is a food critic. And she starts the story like this. Ich muss diese Geschichte mit einem Geständnis beginnen. Ich kann meinen eigenen Namen nicht aussprechen. Solange ich mich erinnere, war es mir unangenehm, mich anderen Menschen vorzustellen. Waren sie Deutsche, konnten sie die melodischen Laute nicht verstehen. Waren sie Vietnamesen, hatten sie Probleme mit meinem harten Akzent. Die Deutschen umgingen das Problem, indem sie mich gar nicht ansprachen. Die Vietnamesen fragten, wie schreibt man das? Einer sagte, bist du dir sicher? Ich erinnere mich an meine kindlichen Versuche, mit meinem Problem umzugehen. Gingen wir zu Karstadt, fuhr ich in die Spielzeugabteilung und suchte unter den bedruckten Bleistiften nach meinem Namen. Gingen wir zum Baumarkt, setzte ich meine Hoffnung auf die bunten, langen Schlüsselanhänger. Wenn ich meinen Namen nur finden würde, dachte ich, wäre das der Beweis, dass alles richtig war mit mir. Hunderte Bleistifte und Schlüsselanhänger durchsuchte ich. Ich fand Katrin, Christina und einmal, da hüpfte mein Herz, Kira. Geo fand ich nicht. Geo existierte nur in der Welt meiner Familie und auf dem Titel eines Buches, das in dem Kellerregal meines Vaters stand. Türen Geo, das Mädchen Geo. Ein Werk, das für die vietnamesische Literatur so wichtig war wie die Leiden des jungen Werther für die deutsche. Natürlich konnte ich es nicht lesen. Immer wenn mein Vater aufräumen musste, holte er dieses Buch hervor und sagte, weißt du eigentlich, dass du nach einer berühmten jungen Frau benannt bist? Jeder Schüler hat diesen Roman gelesen. Du bist in ganz Vietnam bekannt. Und weil ich meinem Vater als Kind alles geglaubt habe, glaubte ich ihm auch das und stellte mich vor, wie ich durch Vietnam laufen und von allen möglichen Leuten angesprochen werden würde. Unzählige Male würde ich mich vorstellen und meinen Namen aussprechen müssen. Unzählige Nachfragen würden darauf folgen. Als ich 16 war, nannte ich mich um, weil ich glaubte, mit einem besseren Namen bessere Chancen zu haben, in Jeanettes Clique aufgenommen zu werden. Als ich 20 war, ließ ich meinen Pass ändern, weil ich endlich so etwas wie Macht über mein Schicksal verspürte. Seit 10 Jahren bin ich eine andere. Die Deutschen sagen Kim zu mir, die Vietnamesen Kim. Es ist nicht richtig, aber es ist einfacher so. Der Verlust meiner Vergangenheit hat mir nichts ausgemacht, wirklich nicht, bis ich diese Nachricht erhielt. This was the German version, as you might have been able to tell. I'm gonna read the English version now, which has been translated by Imogen Taylor. And it goes like this. Let me start the story with a confession. I can't pronounce my own name. For as far back as I can remember, I felt uncomfortable introducing myself to people. If they were German, they couldn't make sense of the melodic sounds. If they were Vietnamese, they had trouble with my harsh accent. Germans dodged the problem by not addressing me by name. Vietnamese people asked, how do you spell that? Once someone said, are you sure about that? I was a child when I first attempted to deal with the problem. When we went to the department store, I would head for the toy section and look for my name on the personalized pencils. When we went to the DIY store, I set my hopes on the long, colorful key rings. If I found my name, I said to myself, it would be proof that there was nothing wrong with me. I sifted through hundreds of pencil and key rings. I found Katrin, Christina, and once my heart skipped a beat, Kira. But there was no Geo. Geo existed only in my family's world in the title of a book that stood on my father's shelf in the cellar. Chuyện Geo, The Tale of Geo. A work as important to Vietnamese literature as The Sorrows of Young Werther to the German canon. I couldn't read it, of course. Whenever my father decided to clean up the house, he pulled out a book and said, "Did you know that you're named after a famous young woman? Every school child in Vietnam has read this book. You are known all over the country." I believed everything my father told me when I was little, so why should that be any different? I imagined walking through Vietnam and being approached by all kinds of people. I would constantly have to keep introducing myself, and each time I would have to say my name. How embarrassing. When I was 16, I changed my name because I thought an easier one would improve my chances of getting accepted into Jeanette's clique. When I was 20, I had my passport modified, and for the first time, I felt power over my destiny. For 10 years, I've been a different person. Germans call me Kim, Vietnamese people Kim. It isn't perfect, but it's easy. Shedding my past has never bothered me. Really, it didn't. Then I got that message. Thank you.
So we know there's something coming when she got that message. What I loved about that first couple of pages of the story is this, I suppose it's a very universal complexity of for anyone who's a second generation immigrant, where they are the person who's still regarded as somehow an outsider, you know, either by virtue of their name or their appearance or where they're from. And what was is very interesting about Giyu is that she doesn't feel quite like she belongs to her parents' culture either, or their country. And I think this is something that you have looked at a lot in your journalism as well, this sort of hybrid identity. What I wanted to ask you though was, when you have looked at this, obviously in your own autobiography, but also in your journalism, then when you said, I'm going to write a novel about this, how did you find it, you know, the sort of leap into then writing this as a piece of creative writing, as, you know, fictionalized story? How did you work with that, and what was the process?
In fact, the book started out as a big project, very much like a documentary. I started doing research about 4 years ago, and I went up to my family, my relatives. I visited them in the States, where some part of the story will take place later in the book. I also visited my family in Vietnam, and I conducted long interviews with, you know, like people have gone through the Vietnam War and the time after. And I really asked them just very simple journalistic questions like, what year were you born in? What was your childhood like? And do you remember the war? How did you end up in California? Tell me how you know, like jumped on that boat, and tell me how you jumped on that boat for the second time, and tell me how you got thrown into jail and what you've experienced there. And after a while, I had quite a lot of material, and I realized that it would be the wrong way to just, you know, approach it as a factual thing and just do a documentary on my family, because really what I want to do is to write a book that transcends my own family and that can speak to certainly to other people who are in a similar cultural situation, but also very much to, you know, like an audience that might not be so familiar with Vietnam or the Vietnam War, and perhaps not even familiar with, you know, like questions of immigration and belonging. And so I chose to fictionalize it and create new characters based on what I knew. And I wanted to write a story that's, you know, quite authentic, the scenes that are described in the book, historical scenes of the war, and or even, you know, like Cambodia in the year 1980. They are based on research. I wanted them to feel right, to feel authentic. I wanted the characters to feel authentic. But then I wanted to, you know, like play God and make them move and behave in a, you know, more extreme way, perhaps, than what my family has been through and or what they're like. And yeah, I think that's, for me, it's a new way of addressing these issues of identity. And I wanted to tell a story that you can, you know, that has all these big topics, but which feels very easy to read, and you can just follow the plot and follow the message and what it contains.
Well, you have absolutely achieved that. I have to say, I really enjoyed it. I would recommend it to everyone. It's a really good read, and yet it's hugely impressive that the amount of historical detail that's there. You know, obviously a lot of it was kind of, you know, new to me. I suppose in the Anglophone world, what we know of the Vietnam War is very much colored by American movies. But apart from that, you know, I put it this way, sometimes you read novels that are based on historical situations, but they can be a bit too historical or, you know, heavy going. And in yours, the characters, I really felt, you know, I knew the characters at the end, and the dialogue rings really true. All the color of everything from the horrible details of what they've lived through in the war and the aftermath, but also the beautiful things, you know, everything from the cooking. You can nearly smell the food and beautiful dresses, because the family of the main character, they had a tailoring business, and you could nearly feel the silk. And so all of those, all of that color is there. What the other thing, what I found personally fascinating about the book, again, probably because I don't know the history that well, was that in the two stories, so your suggested title for the English is Brothers and Ghosts. So apart from Geu, who's the first person narrator in the present day, the story, then there are three narratives, if you like. I'm sorry, I'm just explaining this for the audience. The other two storylines that are sort of told in the third person, but they're of Min, who is Geu's father, and Son, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that properly, who is her uncle, means brother, and who is the source of this mysterious message that comes out of the blue. So, and they have, and I don't want to give too much away, because I know people will want to read the book themselves, but they both experience the Vietnam War in very different ways. Partly Min, because he ends up going, he's sent to Germany to study. His family save up to send him off to Germany to study. He's the eldest son, and he's going to, you know, support them all when he qualifies. And Son stays behind and experiences the war very much on the ground. And that to me was fascinating, that complexity of the difference and then the estrangement between them. But maybe you'd like to read, would you like to read a little bit from the passage where we hear Min's story?
Yes, and it's very fitting because you know, like right now, we just had this beginning of the new lunar year, the new Chinese year, which is also celebrated in Vietnam, and it also takes place on the so-called Tết holiday, and we jump back in time. We go back to the year 1967. And Min, the father of Geu, he's a teenager at that time. He's 17 years old, and he is in Saigon. And I'm just gonna read you a short passage talk about his life. A few weeks later, the year of the monkey had just begun. Min was woken one night by the loud thud of an explosion. Still hazy from sleep, he opened his eyes. It was the first day of the dead New Year celebrations. He had spent all evening on the balcony with his brothers and sisters, looking out at the noisy, decked-out street. Their next-door neighbor, Mr. Zhang, had given him a string of Chinese firecrackers and stood laughing with their father, both men delighted to be on leave and spending the holidays at home. Sorry, I should add, it is the time of the Vietnam War, and there was a ceasefire during that. Dazed, Min wondered what was going on outside. Were people still setting off fireworks? He rolled over onto his side and pulled the pillow over his head. The fan whirled softly beside the bed, blowing cool air into the blue mosquito net. He drifted back to sleep, but was jolted awake again a few minutes later. Boom! There it was again, duller and louder than before. A rumbling sound like heavy thunder, only shorter and nearer sounding. He sat up. His father burst into the room, naked to the waist, clutching a pistol in his hand. Something's going on out there, quick! Min leapt out of bed, grabbed his glasses, and ran downstairs to fetch his brothers and sisters. They hurried into the living room and joined their mother, who was pressed up against the balcony door, looking out. Min saw searchlights slice through the night. In the distance, he heard a rapid rattling sound, a little like the string of firecrackers, except that it was intermittent. Interspersed with this was a dull, rumbling boom, sometimes coming from the north, sometimes from the west. Could it be bombs here in Saigon? Put the radio on, his mother whispered. Min walked over to the sideboard and twisted the volume knob. The Vietnamese station was strangely playing nothing but Beatles song. The reporter on Voice of America sounded agitated. There's a surprise offensive in various cities. Viet Cong fighters in Saigon have attacked the airport and infiltrated the American embassy. There's fighting and shooting. The headquarters of Radio Vietnam are occupied. It seems that the communists tried to broadcast a recorded speech by North Vietnamese President Ho Chi Minh, but fortunately this was prevented by a Radio Vietnam employee. Some fighters have advanced to the presidential palace. How dare they attack during the holidays? Min's father ranted. A 3-day ceasefire, that was the deal. They have no honor, no shame. Adrenaline surged through Min's veins. Although it was pitch black outside, he suddenly felt wide awake. The thought that something dangerous was happening made him jittery with fear, but also curiosity. He had never seen a communist. He wondered if they were really as savage and dirty as his mother said. Pushing his brothers and sisters out of the way, he opened the balcony door a crack. A rush of cool air hit him. Feeling his courage grow as his siblings whispered in fear, he stepped out onto the balcony. He went right up to the balustrade to get a better view of the street. It was strewn with shreds of red paper from the spent firecrackers, but otherwise so empty that you could have swept it with a giant broom. The black power cables that were strung between the tall masts swung gently in the air. Far off in the distance, a gray cloud of smoke rose from the sea of houses. Everything is quiet, he said, a hint of disappointment in his voice. There's no one about. You can go back to bed. Thank you.
Yes, that must have been it's every bit as scary as it feels quite terrifying in the telling of it. And then that was, of course, only the beginning. And the reason that in the story why it means parents really want to have him, study. He's studying in the French system, isn't he? He's going to do a baccalaureate. This is sort of remnants of the colonial French system in Vietnam, and his parents save up so that they can send him abroad then to study, to try and save him from having to be drafted in the army. So he goes off to Germany, and studies medicine, which he doesn't even want to study. I have to say as well, I'm tell the audience that the book is very funny. There's some really, really funny and bizarre aspects to it. And he then, I wanted to mention as well, that even though, you know, the proposed title is Brothers and Ghosts, but actually the female characters in the novel I thought were really powerful and you know, pivotal actually to the plot in many ways. So Min goes off to Germany in 1967, or, you know, into 68, which is at the height of the student movement in Germany and the anti-Vietnam War protests. And he arrives over there and really hasn't a clue. And then he meets Hoa, is that how you pronounce Hoa, who's also Vietnamese. She's got a scholarship from the government to study in Germany. And she has become active in the protesting against what's happening in Vietnam, so much so that her scholarship is revoked and she can't pay her student accommodation anymore and ends up moving in with Min, which then becomes their sort of their love story. But she's a wonderful character as well. I mean, did you, when you were modeling, you know, the characters, was somebody like Hoa someone that you knew in your family, or was it somebody sort of a composite of other people that you met?
Yeah, I mean, my mother, she feels that the character of Hoa is based on her, and she had some feedback on the way Hoa was described. But there's also, and she indeed, my mother did have a scholarship from the Vietnamese government. She came from a poor family. But I can tell you that the story of the scholarship being revoked is based on another person's real stories. Another person got, you know, like politically active whilst being abroad, and then he got into trouble, and he told me this, and so I merged it into this character. Mm-hmm. And in general, I think what I would like to say is that Vietnamese women are very strong in general. I think it's a great misconception in the West, perhaps fueled by the love letters and films and books that American war reporters and such have written about, you know, obedient, submissive Vietnamese women. And it's not true. The Vietnamese women I know are very, you know, they work, they raise their children, they take care of the household. They're very strong, even though it's a culture where men definitely have, you know, the upper hand. But they're, you know, like, I think this is why a lot that the female characters in my book, including Hoa, they play such a big role, and they have, you know, like a strong will. They're very active. They sometimes, you know, they in this case with Hoa and Min, she is the one who actually pushes him, inspires him to get involved in anti-war politics, mm-hmm. Which then sets him apart from his family back home. And again, this is something which, you know, like this is a big kind of plot line in my book, but it's also something that many Vietnamese families across the world know very well, because the Vietnam War was, you know, not only a war between Vietnam and the US, but it was, you know, first started off, you know, it was also a civil war between the North mm-hmm. and the South. Mm-hmm. You have many families that were torn apart between these two sides.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think, again, that's something I think that can resonate with readers from, you know, any culture who have experienced war, even if, you know, in the Irish context, we had a civil war, it's 100 years ago now, but it's still, you know, affects everyday politics. And there would have been, you know, people of my generation, their parents never even spoke about it, and their grandparents, because it had divided families. So there are a lot of these suppressed stories of conflict. And
I think that's definitely something which is also that was very much on my mind, the question of, how do these big events, big historical events shape the life of normal people? We look at war, we look at big geopolitical context, for example, like take Russia, Ukraine right now. And we talk about them in a very analytical way. But then they have a lasting impact. They have a lasting impact on societies, even after, peace has been found. And this, like if you don't, even if families often find it quite hard to talk about these political traumas, I feel that they are actually passed on from one generation to the next. And even the inability to speak about it is a way of communication. It's something that is passed on from one generation to the next. So, but for me, in my book, it was also quite interesting. I was very interested in exploring this inability to speak, with the main character who doesn't know how to speak her name. It's one example, but there's also a character who's actually deaf. And then you have all these kind of, you have all these scenes where people cannot speak to each other because they don't speak the same language, or even if they do, they don't find the right words. And I think that's something which I know from my own experience very well, but then where I feel that it's also something that many other people have seen and experienced in their own families. And I'm always very happy to hear when they tell me that's something it resonates with them. They can see themselves in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just looking at the clock, Khuê, and I think we try and maybe put some of the questions from the audience into the discussion. I think we've been touching on some of them, but I'll just see that there was a question earlier on, was wondering whether your feel for language is influenced by your multilinguality, the fact that you speak many languages yourself. Do you think that has influenced your writing style in the novel?
It's very hard to say. I think when you speak different languages, you gain access to different schools of thoughts, different worldviews, especially if the languages are very different. So let me give you an example. I don't speak Vietnamese that well, but it has a completely different system of addressing other people. If I, if I speak to you, Rachel, in English, I would just say you. And no matter, no matter who you are. But if we were speaking Vietnamese, I would probably call you aunt, because I would like to pay respect to your age, that you're older than me, which is a good thing. There are also very complicated pronouns then when it comes to family relations, like an aunt who is married to my uncle, who is the older brother of my father. There were very specific words for that. So it means in Vietnamese, you're always placing yourself in a hierarchy with others. You always see yourself in relation to others, and in the train of thought is very much, like a family system. Whereas, of course, in English or German, you see yourself more as an individual, and you have that linguistically. Indeed, it's very different, and you have in German grammar, it's very complicated. You have different articles, and you have very complicated ways of, like changing the verbs and the nouns depending on the time, like tense that you're using, whereas in Vietnamese you don't even have different tenses. So I think for me that is really something that has been very influential. Me just trying to think about, like how do people see themselves, what's this, as individuals. Or in this story we learn that Geo, even though she rejects so much of her Vietnamese heritage, is still very much a family person. She does somehow innately understand that she is part of a bigger group, and sometimes she has to put her own individual desires behind. And I would say that this perhaps has been very important, and the most important thing to me. Not so much the word itself, but the style of thinking.
In the novel, certainly the family loyalty, the importance of family, but also the complexity of dealing with that and trying to carve your own way when you're part of a big group is very strong. And actually, one of the questions in the chat as well was whether this is still true, or whether it's a sort of a for instance, Ireland would have been very traditional 50 years ago as well, and family ties. And if you did anything different, it was, a big deal. But we've become much more modern, I suppose, and much more liberal. And so I suppose in your story, set in 2016, very recent, the Geo sense is still very much of the bond of family and loyalty to family. And on the one hand, you picked a lovely quote from it for the sort of the promo, saying, you have all these relatives that you don't even know, or Geo doesn't, and you light candles or incense sticks once a year, but there's and yet the story, she discovers all these relatives again, and missing links as well that help her to, I think, ultimately make really strong decisions. Actually, there's one character in the story, I loved her as well. In the US, we haven't had any sort of reading from the part of the story that's set in LA, in Little Saigon, where Sun and his family live, and then Geo meets outside one of the many restaurants they go to eat, and she meets this wonderful character, Lee, who is a sort of, again, part of the Vietnamese diaspora, but she has kicked over the traces. She does her own thing, and she kind of helps you navigate her way and make some very difficult decisions. How did you create that character?
I have the feeling that something is happening in the Vietnamese diaspora right now, amongst the second generation. That's not only referring to the Vietnamese diaspora in Germany, but also in other countries. I see it on social media. I've also had a chance to meet a few people who are, musicians, or like direct films or theater plays. There's this new energy of people who have reached an age and perhaps a confidence to express these cultural conflicts, and perhaps also, combat stereotypes about what Asian people are like. And I think this is what inspired this character, Lee. She also has her own troubles, because she's lesbian, and it's difficult in the Vietnamese culture for her to combine that, but still she has a much more, I think, much more confident way. And she's the one who's the only one really who can understand Geo, and who's the only one who is able to kind of penetrate the surface and bring to light what is actually there. And I think that very often with these cultural conflicts, if you only, I think a lot of people feel that they're alone. I don't know what it's like in the UK, because it does seem to be much more multicultural than Germany, but still, I think, especially when they're younger, when they're teenagers, people feel that they don't really fit in, and they don't really, nobody's really like them, and they cannot really talk about it. And it is through other people that we sometimes find it easier to, voice our issues, and in a way make them acceptable. So that's why I wanted to have this character. And in fact, this is also a bit what this book is about. You know, like a lot of people in Germany who belong to the second generation Vietnamese people told me that they read the book and they felt really seen by it. They felt that somebody is giving them a voice, and they could relate to the characters. And so far there has been, you know, there hasn't really been, there's not so much other, you know, in the media or in the arts, literature, film, there's just not so many, there are just not so many characters they can relate to. So it's a way of, you know, so kind of getting together and talking to each other.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. I have another question here that was interesting in that, wondering where you quote the Kyo said, Kyo says, or her father says, your name is very famous. Everybody in Vietnam would know your name because there's this famous tale of Kyo, the story. So I was wondering, are there any sort of parallels, you know, that we wouldn't maybe recognize as readers who are not familiar with the tale, but were you bringing in any elements of that famous epic into your narrative? And then there's another question in the chat wondering, were you inspired by The Mountains Sing by Nguyen
Phan Quy
Quy Mai? Yeah.
This is a book which by a Vietnamese writer, which is also a family tale, and it also relates to the war. She sent it to me, and I haven't started reading yet, but I definitely want to read it. I heard many good things about it, but no, it wasn't related. It wasn't really inspired by her, but it's funny to see, you know, because our books came out roughly around the same time. And hers is also, you know, available in English. And it was very interesting to see that we have both picked the format of a family story and a multi-generational story to, you know, to cover large chunks of history through the different generations of a family. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a coincidence, but maybe not so much, because I feel that a lot of Asian diaspora literature somehow often chooses the form of the family story, probably because it's such an important cultural concept. And the Tale of Geo, I have read it, but it's quite different. I wanted to allude to it, but I didn't want to write a new version of it, because there have been attempts to do it. It's a Vietnamese classic, and you know, like it's very much centered on the, you know, there's also a character who's a woman and who goes through different trials and love and desperation. But in the end, I think my book is not so much, you know, like the values that are that drive the book are not Confucian values, such as in the Tale of Geo. Yeah, I'm a more, you know, like I grew up in Germany. I'm very interested in some questions of how do you find yourself, how do you express yourself, how do you uncover the truth. Yeah. And also I just saw that on the chat. And the question, somebody picked up on that, the inability to speak about the Vietnam War, and the inability to speak within German families about the Third Reich. That is definitely something that has played a part in this whole process, subconsciously, I think. It's only later that I realized that what I did with my relatives was very similar to what a lot of young Germans have been doing. They went up to their grandparents or parents and asked them, you know, what did you do during the war? Mm-hmm. Because there had been so much silence in the families before that.
Yes, it's true, and it's a hard. Well, it's an easy question to ask, but it's not easy to. It's not an easy topic, and it's very difficult if people aren't able to speak about it, or willing to speak about it. Just speaking about literature as well, I love asking if I'm interviewing writers, I love to ask them who their favorite writers are, or who are you reading at the moment, or what's your literary world that inspires you?
So right now I'm reading Hanya Yanagihara, To Paradise, which of course is a big bestseller, and I was a huge fan of A Little Life, which made me cry so hard. But I'm also with these questions of culture and how do you tell the story. There are some Vietnamese writers who have, who I admire very much, Ocean Vuong, or The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen. And he just brought out a new book. I forgot what the English title is, but A Place in Paris. It's also very good. But I also like, for example, Chimamanda Adichie's Americana. I don't know if any of you have read it, but it's completely different cultural context. It's like a story set in Nigeria and the US. But what I liked about it so much was the ease with which she was telling the story, and the love story that powers it, and the funny bits and the funny details. And that's something that I aim for as well, to make it a bit and make it entertaining too, not only difficult, not only academic, but make it a good read. And that's what I really admired about her way of doing it.
Well, I think you have definitely achieved that. I think it's a great read, your novel, and as I say, I would highly recommend it. And for anyone who reads German, I just to let you know, you can probably see a poster here behind me, which is for the Goethe-Institut library. You can get the book in the library, wherever you are from the Goethe-Institut, in German, obviously in hardback or ebook. Is there an audiobook yet?
Not yet, no.
Not yet, and it would be great to have an audiobook as well. It'd be wonderful to listen to. I can actually see it being turned into a movie as well. But yes, anyway, available hopefully in English at some point. And I'm sure very often books are translated into all the other languages before English gets a look in, but hopefully it'll come out in many languages. Are there any more questions, or did we miss any?
Yeah,
questions?
there's some questions about the Vietnamese families, and two questions. So I just want to pick up on that. So my own family. So how some people have asked me, what did your family say when the book came out? How do they feel about it? And so I have to say first that only one small part of my family has been able to read it, namely the German part, my parents and my siblings. And I gave them the manuscript before it was published because I wanted to make sure that, there would be no bad surprises. And they do know that it's, a piece of fiction, but they recognize, they do recognize some of our family in it. And of course, they also get reactions. And my parents at first were, like typical Vietnamese parents, they didn't say much, like they said it was all right. They didn't like the first chapter. I thought it was a bit boring. And then the historical parts were more into dramatic and entertaining, they felt. But now, like the book came out, and it was very well received in Germany. And my parents got a lot of comments, from colleagues or others, and so they got into it, and they've been sending, they and my siblings, they've been going to every bookstore they pass, and then check whether, whether my book will be on a top table or what, and then they'll send me a picture. So now they're really, I think they're quite happy about it. I feel that it's something that we all share, which is lovely. And then my Vietnamese and my American relatives have not had a chance to read it yet, which is, one reason why I would love it to be translated into those languages. I have no idea how they will react to it. But I can say that the whole process of doing these interviews, getting to know their stories also meant getting to know them. And it has brought us closer. I am, like you, quite removed from a large part of my family because they live so far away, and we don't have a chance to see each other very often. So we don't get to know we don't know each other on an individual level that well. And so I was glad I had the chance to do that, to, you know, through the context of my book, explore my own family, have a pretext to asking them all these questions, which I would normally never ask. So I think it's been it's not always been easy, and, you know, but on the whole, it's been a very good experience for me and for them. There's another question about Vietnamese family, and how much influence parents have on their children's lives. It's what do they study, who they marry, how they conduct their lives. Is that a misconception? I would say that I personally feel that I am probably very loyal to my my parents, and I see them very often, especially now that I have a baby, and that's something that my German boyfriend sometimes finds a bit strange. That's not something that he's used to in his culture. Did they decide what I should study, who I should marry? No. And I think with it probably depends a bit on, you know, who you're talking to. But on the whole, I would probably say that culturally, of course, in Vietnamese culture, you do feel that your parents are an authority, you know, like even when you have reached the age of, you know, like 18 or 20 or 30 years, still your parents, you know, are a source of authority in your life. And you don't leave them as, I guess, sometimes people do in Western culture, or some Western German culture. Not every Western culture is like that. So perhaps from that perspective, it might seem like parents have a very strong influence, but I feel that it's not quite as dictatorial in that they decide who to marry or who to study. It's at least from the diaspora families I know, it's not like that, because they live in the West, and even in Vietnamese families, I think today it's not quite traditional like that.
Great. I'm just looking at the clock, and I'm afraid we're going to have to finish there. That was a great discussion, and thank you very much, Khuê. I'm going to hand back to Oya for a minute, I think, just to wrap up, and just say it was a pleasure to talk to you, Khuê, about your work.
It was a pleasure. I'm so glad I had the chance to do this. Of course, I would love to come back to Ireland in person, but yeah, it was a real pleasure. And thanks to the audience for tuning in and for taking an interest in this German Vietnamese book, and for putting forward your questions. It was really nice for me to do this and to meet new people, if you want.
Well, then I can only thank both of you, Khuê and Rachel, for this fascinating insight, not only into the book, but also into the context and this partly personal way of introducing your idea and your work. Thank you so much. And thank you, Rachel, for providing the context. Thank you to the audience for tuning in, for listening, for your questions and comments. It was lovely to see such a big crowd. Thank you so much. And the last thing I would like to say is that the next European Book Club organized by the EUNIC group, takes place on the 3rd of March and will be hosted by the Instituto Cervantes in Dublin. Have a very good evening. Lovely to see you all, as they say in Ireland here. And see you next time. Bye.